So I'll start introducing Jin Xue. She's a professor in urban and regional sustainability planning at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Her research interests are in urban and housing sustainable development, second home planning, post-growth urban development and planning, and urban futures based on a scenario planning and critical realism. She comes more from the planning, more a bigger scale. We went to a smaller scale with Daniel, later also with Alejandro. But also as architects, we work in more this urban scale. And also have to say, Jin Xue, like every time that you want to look for something related to housing and degrowth, she's there in all the papers, mentioned in all the conferences. So I think I'm very happy that she's here, that we can have her, because I think she's one of the authors that needs to be accounted as one of the first researchers really looking into the possibilities and the limits and of these ideas of degrowth and housing and how they can relate. So as I said, now we will go a little bit more academic, but I think it's something that we need to lay the foundations for the future debates and projects that we will have. So we will have both speakers, one after the other, and then we can have a joint discussion. Thank you, Jin.
Thank you very much, Carlos. And I'm very happy to come to visit Barcelona again. As Carlos has introduced, actually has started to engage with degrowth and try to make a link to urban development, spatial dimension and planning in quite early days. Around 2009 when I did my PhD project. So at that time, I already had some connection with the degrowth environment in Barcelona. So have also come to visit the city several times. Yes, so I come from an urban planning background, but of course, planning is so much related to architecture. And when I started my bachelor degree, actually the first 2 years are actually about architecture design. So these two disciplines are certainly very well connected. But I will certainly lift the scope a little bit to the larger issues about the municipal, urban development, and also perhaps regional development. And by planning, I actually mean the planning that is very much following the planning and building law in different countries. And that's mainly about the regional planning, municipal planning, zoning plan, and yes, and also at the territorial level. So it's very much about land use planning and spatial planning. So I don't go much into the environmental planning or energy planning or transportation planning. That's not the kind of planning that I'm talking about today. Yes, so therefore you know that my entry point to the degrowth topic is from the planning perspective. The reason that I started to engage with is because the early debates in degrowth really irritated me, because they don't have a spatial focus on that. And I also believe that any kind of societal transformation needs to be a spatial transformation. So in that sense, planning through intervening the land use and the built environment infrastructure plays a very important role as a driving force, potential driving force for degrowth transformation. But at the same time, I also have to admit that current planning or the mainstream planning is very much based on the growth ideology, on the growth thinking. That has something to do with the history, the root of the planning discipline. I will come back to that later on. So my research therefore has a strong focus on a critical perspective of the eco-modernist planning that is framed by the green growth idea. And I would argue that the very popular norms in planning field, like compact city, densification, certainly has a very positive impact on the environment, but at the same time, it's a very typical eco-modernist planning strategy. And so therefore, it's naturally that I moved to post-growth planning, or in the early days, it's called degrowth planning. But I think nowadays it's opened to post-growth planning, which is a more general umbrella that tries to catch up the different alternatives to the growth-oriented planning. And so I also drawn on scenario planning, normative, explorative ones, and particular backcasting to understand how we can actually achieve a post-growth planning. In addition to that, I work generally about land use planning, second home planning in the Nordic countries, especially in Norway, especially to look at how those type of the land use planning takes into account nature conservation, climate change issues. And for example, when it comes to second home planning, if you know that this is a very strong tradition in the Norwegian culture, that people have cabins in the wild nature, in the mountains along the coastline. So I try to also bring a degrowth perspective there by looking at this phenomenon as a multi-dwelling lifestyle, which is based on very luxury consumption. Yes, also my work is very much inspired by critical realism. Maybe it sounds a little bit philosophical, but I will also draw on some concepts from this philosophy of science to reflect on some ontologic dimension of planning, but also architect. I also want to very briefly mention that even though the degrowth debates in Norway were not so widespread or popular generally compared to countries in the southern part of Europe, but we did have some years ago the architecture triennial some focuses on degrowth. So that's very interesting to say how the debates were actually raised at that time. So in this presentation, I will go through 3 topics. First, I want to reflect a little bit on the ontologic dimension of planning, and that's also very relevant to architecture. Because I think now we are living in a world with polycrisis, and by polycrisis, it means the ecological crisis, the social crisis, the political democratic crisis, they are all linked. So therefore, for either planning or architecture, we need to have this holistic perspective to understand and also to tackle with those this polycrisis. So that's very important to have a comprehensive understanding of what planning is and how planning could relate to the different dimensions of the crisis. And based on that, I will introduce the concept of sufficiency planning. And Daniel has mentioned sufficiency, so I will elaborate a little bit on that and how it can function as a foundational principle for planning in the future. And after that, I will narrow down to the housing issues and try to talk about how we can take a multi-scalar strategy for degrowth housing development, because I think we really need to take this multi-scalar perspective seriously when we talk about degrowth. And I would also argue that actually it's hard to say whether this strategy is degrowth strategy or not degrowth strategy, because it needs to be settled in the context, in the specific settings. So that's that. Yeah. So I will try to show how this functions, but still this is kept at a very general level. But I think, but you have your own background in architecture and you have been involved in many so concrete projects. So I hope this could be some elements that can inspire you. So first, an ontologic exploration. Well, I would not go very deeply into the philosophical world, but I will say that this concept for planet social being is a concept that is from critical realism. You don't need to know what critical realism is, but I just briefly explain it, what this four-planar social being is. And this is a concept which says that every social activity, practice, and being exist simultaneously on four interdependent planes. So, of course, we can consider architecture, we can consider urban planning, urban design, or even social movement as social activity. So, no one would deny that this is one type of social activity. So, then what are the four planes? I will guide you through this. You don't need to grasp every details in this figure. So, the first plan is that any social activity has a material transaction. So, no matter what we are doing, planning, of course, we need to be aware that it's based on nature. It has some connections and transactions with the material world, with the natural environment. And Plan B says that every social activity will happen also on the plane of social interactions. And that's also, you can think about your practices as architect. Of course, when you do architecture design, you need to involve people. And that's the same for planning. And planning would not be possible without engaging different types of actors. And the third plan is a plan of social relation. And that is, we could also understand it as social structures, the more stable, established ones. For example, the legal structures, political structures, cultural structures that so every social activity takes within the social structures, but also either maintain or transform or reshape those social structures. And the last one goes to the plan of stratification of personality. In other words, it's about human agency. So any kind of social activity can only be conducted by human agency. So therefore, what would then the implications of this model? That means that when we try to understand something, some social movement, social interventions, activities, we need to understand this on those four planes. They, of course, have specific characteristics and features on each plane, but at the same time, they are quite interconnected. It also has meanings for future. So if we are going to have social change, we also need to transform the four planes at the same time. And also, of course, there are historical experiences where we failed with the social transformation, which could be explained by that we do not really, we might perhaps only focus on a couple of plans and ignore other plans. So this model really provides a very non-reductionist ground for understanding and analyzing, and also reflecting, reprofiling the planning field. And this is a kind of table that tries to translate those four plans in the planning context. So I have already mentioned this a little bit. So for example, on Plan A, those being aware of this natural transaction, material transaction, actually takes acknowledges the existence of natural limits and the planetary boundaries. It also takes an anti-anthropocentric perspective, which means that our human nature society is part of the nature. So, but nature and human, they are not interdependent. We are dependent on nature, but nature is not dependent on us. So this is a very unsymmetric dependency. So planning, if we can recognize this, we also mean that, of course, planning has a lot of impacts on the non-human nature, on the ecosystem, and that's why, because of course land use change is the most important drivers of biodiversity loss. So that points out the important role of planning in this context. And meanwhile, the climate change and also the natural disasters as a result of this poses new conditions and challenges for planning to deal with. On the plan B, social interactions, as I explained, planning is actually about diverse interactions between professionals, civil society, the politicians, the private sectors, public sectors, and so on. If you're familiar with planning theories or the debates in planning theories, actually in the past decades, the most focus is on these interactions. For example, community planning theory, agnostic planning theory, deliberative planning theory is all about how these interactions should be for planning. And of course, planning is also trying to influence the social interactions towards some desired modes. We have some norms. For example, we want to have equity. We want to avoid segregation. We also sometimes also talk about social mixed, even though it's quite contested. But in planning, there are some normative values which points out the desired social reactions we want to have. On the plan C, it's social structure. That means planning is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening within structures. Those structures could include the structures within planning. That's the legal structures, the law, that the planning law really defines the how planning should be conducted, implemented, and made. Of course, there could also be cultural, moral structures within planning. And also, planning is acting within larger societal structures. They are not part of the planning, but they do have very big impacts, shaping the possibilities of planning. For example, the land and property ownership certainly constrains planning's possibility and potentials to realize some social goals. And also political structures, for example, how the positional dimension between planners and politicians has a big say on the power of planning. And on the plan D, we talk about the agency. So that could mean the planner's agency. And different planning models, they certainly point out planners taking very different identities. Are they moderators? Are they engineers, social workers? Or they are also kind of advocates of vulnerable groups. So there can be different planners' agency. And of course, planning influences the agency and action of other agents. There's a lot of studies showing how built environment have a big impact on subjective well-being and on how people utilize their spaces and their daily life. So this means that when we talk about any kind of planning interventions, we need to reflect on those 4 plans, and at the same time being aware that they are quite interconnected, and that can be trade-offs. And it also means that a land use intervention or land use strategy that is functioning on one plan can have negative consequences on the other plans. So, for example, when we renovate the green renovation of existing neighborhoods, that's the environmental friendly strategy, but that has also led to eco-gentrification, for example. So that's a kind of outcome that lies on the other plan. So therefore, planning needs to have this holistic understanding of the different dimensions. So therefore, I also try to ask you or inspire you to reflect on, based on your own background, how would architecture and design relate to nature, social interaction, social structure, and individual well-being so as to contribute to a good future? If we could also take a holistic perspective. based on this model. And so now I will move to the sufficiency planning. So Carlos has explained what degrowth is. And I think for me, those equations that came from the 1970s is still very illustrative and explanative to understand how or what is the focus of degrowth. So if you say the equation there, of our impacts, environmental impacts, is also based on the affluence level, the technology, and the population. Population somehow is very controversial in the degrowth debates, but the green growth or the mainstream paradigm focuses a lot on the technology and the eco-efficiency strategies. But the degrowth actually emphasizes the affluence level, which is about the level of production and consumption. So, therefore, the sufficiency planning or post-growth planning actually takes this limitation very seriously and aims for the reduction in consumption. And in terms of consumption, that could be the land consumption, housing consumption, our travel volume, and the different aspects that can be influenced by planning. So I think we need to understand a little bit what are the current planning paradigm is in order to understand sufficiency planning. The dominant planning, I would say, is both growth-oriented and also growth-dependent. Growth-oriented means that we always aim to have local economic growth, value creation, being competitive, and also if we have a shrinkage situation, if we don't have local economic growth, usually planning is in panic and try to reverse the trend. And that has something to do with the history of planning, which I don't have time to elaborate, but also has strong relation with the political ideology of growth. But the growth is planning is also growth dependent. The researcher Yvonne Reading from UK, she published this book around 10 years ago, where she explained why planning is growth dependent. That means that the planning system is dependent on urban development and urban growth through the market actors in order to gain profits and to utilize these profits to benefit, to realize the larger societal goals. So that, of course, many reasons that lead to this dependency, for example, the austerity policies, and also the lack of physical, the lack of government income, and so on. So therefore, planners, they have to facilitate the private sector to urban development, and through some planning mechanisms, for example, the different mechanisms in different countries, but it could be agreement with the developers. So much part of this profits from urban development can be utilized to be invested in schools or developing green structures or some other social public goods. So that's creates a dependency for the planning on urban development and growth. So a sufficiency planning is therefore a move from the growth dependent and the growth oriented planning paradigm. To elaborate a little bit on the sufficiency concept, usually we can say that the sufficiency concept includes the limitarianism and also the sufficientarianism. So the limitarianism focuses on the maximum to the number of goods people can have, all the society can have. And that's this kind of ceiling is it's constrained by the planetary boundaries. And the sufficient, the sufficientarianism is about a minimum limit. It's the lower threshold for consumption, and that is based on the principle of social justice. So everyone's basic needs to be satisfied, and to be able to fulfill that basic needs, there's some minimum you have. For example, you need to have air, water, and the house, the dwelling. So there should be some minimum limit. So therefore, those two thresholds are based on different considerations. And that therefore creates a consumption corridor with a ceiling and with a lower threshold. So yeah, as I said, they are based on different principles. But what I want to emphasize here is that for the minimum limit, we talk about basic needs, but we also need to separate these needs from wants and designs. And also basic needs, they can be satisfied by different satisfiers. And those satisfiers actually have quite different environmental impacts. A good example is the Norwegian preferences for the cabins in the mountains. So let us think about the main argument for the Norwegians to have cabins is that they want to have close, they want to have this closeness to nature, to enjoy nature. If that is a basic need, I would argue that there are way better environmental friendly satisfiers to meet this need than building the cabins. And so therefore, I think a discussion should be made about what are the basic needs and how these needs can be satisfied. So taking this sufficiency idea, they are of course full of challenges. One challenge is that we should define the minimum need satisfied by taking into account the ecological ceiling. The problem with nowadays in the developed countries is that our minimum limit is already set at a higher level than what is allowed by the planetary boundaries. So therefore, if we are going to take this seriously, we should really think about this basic needs concept. What are the basic needs also? And also, this sufficiency idea, should we consider it as an individual voluntary activities within this neoliberal context which provides opportunities for fulfilling different preferences, or should we consider it as a societal organizing principle? I would argue for the latter, and that means that we need to transform the society. So taking that, I would then consider or introduce this sufficiency planning by also reflecting on the different plans. So it goes more details into what kind of planning strategies we can utilize and what kind of norms and values we need to change. When it comes to the Plan A, by the way, this is based on a paper that was published this year. So on Plan A, material transactions with nature, for the implications for planning, if you look at on the right side, it means that planning should be based on the premise of environmental conditions and the biocapacity as absolute limit. And this has to be taken seriously because I think this should also have consequences on our planning activities, because very often in practice, when we say there is a conflict about land use between development and nature conservation, it's usually the development that wins, and then the nature has to be sacrificed. So I think if we take this absolute limit seriously, we should certainly prioritize the environmental side. And also that means we should expand the planners at work, say, from representing the vulnerable social groups to also representing the environment and non-human beings. And I would say perhaps this is not very well theorized in the planning field, because we have advocacy planning theory and model, but that's very often about the vulnerable social groups in the society. And also, I think we should invoke new concepts like housing sufficiency, transportation sufficiency, and land use sufficiency. That means we need to cap those kind of consumptions. For example, is that possible to talk about the maximum housing consumption per capita? We had a research study a couple of years ago, which shows that if Norway now has a per capita housing consumption that is with 55 square meters per capita. So that's one of the highest in the world. And if we just reduce this residential floor area consumption to a couple of square meters, we can actually reduce a lot of land take and also residential energy consumption. And also to think about new concepts like land sufficiency and to really bound the urban, the conversion of natural land to the built environment. And also, I think we need to revitalize the instrumental rationality in planning, which is very much criticized in the past in the planning field. Because if we are going to achieve or to reduce environmental footprints, ecological consequences, we certainly need to know what kind of land use interventions and strategies we need to achieve that purpose. So therefore, I think this instrumental rationality is still quite necessary in planning. And on Plan B, we could talk about recompose the minimum norms by incorporate well-being within an ecological ceiling, because the minimum norms in planning are quite normal, I would say, because we often have minimum standards. For example, in Norway, we should have when we build the houses, it cannot be lower than 35 square meters per unit. And we also have building standards that relate to the minimum hours for sound and also those kind of minutes, this minimum standards. And also the access to transportation, the distance to the transportation infrastructure, the green space per capita, and those are about minimum norms. But I think we should really reflect on these minimum norms by considering what resources we are available to utilize. And also we can think about redistributive planning, which is very challenging in the planning field. For example, when it comes to the transportation sector, can we talk about reallocating of the road spaces, not just to provide road and infrastructure to both cars, pedestrians, and public transportation, but actually talking about redistribution within the existing spaces, so the pedestrians and the public transportation can be prioritized. And also this, I think it should be done in a very democratic way by combining planners as the experts and also utilize this deliberative, communicative planning rationalities in the plan-making process. On the Plan C, the social structures, I think that's the most tricky dimensions. Because I think sufficiency planning challenges existing crisis-prone social structures, both within and beyond the planning system. So I think we certainly need transformations within the planning, within the structures, within planning. For example, the planning law in the Norwegian context, this law does not give much power to planners to secure affordable housing, for example. And the current planning system is very much facilitating the land take other than avoiding land take. So there are many of these structures within planning that hindrance the planning to be more transformative. But also, I think on the larger social, economic, cultural dimensions as a society, this needs to be transformed. For example, when we talk about sufficiency ideas with planners in practice, they often say that we are professionals. We listen to the politicians. We give neutral advices, and then it's the politicians who make the decisions. So if the political ideology is so much dominated by growth, and certainly I think this leaves very little space for the planning to act. On the last dimension, on the agency side, I usually talk about the planner's agency and divide them into three categories. The first category is perhaps the ones that I think the most, which I don't like, is the most passive planners who consider them as neutral and also only give professional advices. The second category, I think, is what I call the professionally active planners. That means that they do not only deliver according to what the politicians said, but also trying to proposes different alternatives to the business as usual. So in that way, the planners are more active in their professional fields. And the last one, I would call the political active planners. That means we move planners from a more professional sphere to the political sphere, and that creates more transformative agency from planners to facilitate, mobilize, and build alliances. I think this last category is very rare in today's planning practices. Okay, in the last part of this presentation, I will talk about the multi-scalar strategies and focus on the Howden development. These multi-scalar dimensions, this scalar dimension is also something I have been quite concerned with in the degrowth debates, because I think the degrowth debate very often focus on small scale projects, and they do not really consider how this can be scaled up and how also it can be scaled in. I mean, it means to make some radical changes to the social structures. And also sometimes I feel that there is a gap about this scalar dimensions in the degrowth. So therefore, I have developed this article about how we can better take into account the scalar dimensions in degrowth. So there I have also discussed the different concepts, for example, the different scalar mechanisms that take place at the neighborhood level, the municipal level, also the for example regional level, because there can be different spatial mechanisms. Different land use strategies could have different impacts on the society nature and the economy. So this scalar mechanisms should that's part of the planner's job, to actually develop this knowledge of how spatial mechanisms influence the society. And also, I think it's about, for example, cross-scale impacts. The bubble shows there on the bottom left. And that means that when we take degrowth strategies, we need to consider how it impacts on other scales. So this is a very conceptual model, but tries to bring these scalar dimensions into the field. But a little bit more concrete. This can be controversial, but I think it's good to have some discussions. I utilize this housing degrowth as an example. So, what is housing degrowth? I'm thinking at the national scale because there's some sense that can be better done at the national scale. So the different scales they have different political settings and different political systems that have also different powers and capacities to deal with these issues. And at the national scale, for example, we can think about setting upper and lower standards, like what we do in some technical guidelines and standard books for developers or for municipalities. And housing degrowth is also about decommodification, and that certainly will happen, I think, at more national level if we want to have large scale impacts. And also more distributive schemes, legal frameworks, where we can materialize the upper and lower standard. This has to be the place that those strategies can take place. We can also think about progressive taxation when people consume their consume dwellings. If you, for example, exceed the certain square meters, you probably need to pay more tax. And that's the progressive taxation is we utilize in when it comes to income. So certainly this can be a strategy for other purposes. And also the transformation of housing market, financial regulations, housing provision system can be changed at the national level. And there are some existing planning arenas or tools that we can utilize. For example, stipulate land use principles in in some planning tools. This can vary from country to country, and also formulate guidelines to determine the quality of small dwellings, for example. And in Norway, we recently published this national guideline for architecture quality. So could that be a place where we define what quality is in line with the degrowth values? At the urban scale, I think we should not generalize what degrowth strategy is because I think that has something to do with the context. If we are talking about the city that is experiencing constant population growth and also housing shortages, has very low per capita housing standards, or and then I think it's a legitimate strategy, degrowth strategy, to build new dwellings by incorporating the degrowth values, but also secure the housing accessibility through different policies. But also there can be cities where there is a large part of vacant dwellings, depopulation, and so on, like those rural municipalities in many Nordic countries. And in that sense, I think it's not certainly degrowth strategy to build more dwellings. It's actually about, we should talk about demolition for rebuilding or repurposing. So I think, therefore, there can be different strategies depending on the context. And on the neighborhood and the individual building skills, we should also look at the context. If there is a huge housing demand, we could think about implementing degrowth values through the construction process, the organization of the community to have new, innovative schemes like urban commoning, land, or kind of diverse or innovative land ownership strategies and so on. We should also consider the neighborhood spatial mechanism. For example, creating shared spaces, increase the proximity to a variety of urban structures. But I think in cities where we don't need to build more since we have enough, we can also consider restructuring the existing neighborhoods, not certainly the design side, the physical side, but actually the social side. Can we have the community, develop the community, new community strategies to strengthen caring and other social dimensions in this existing neighborhoods. And of course, in the individual building designs, so I don't take it for granted that we will build, we have this need to build. I think actually Degrowth talks about avoiding building and also avoid expanding the built up environment. So if we need to build, I think we need to have flexibility and also smart design that can adapt to the life phases and the changing demands. So how we, for example, satisfy the need with just small dwellings. What is the quality? Because I think quality in the Norwegian context also takes it for granted that it has to be big enough. But I think this kind of standards can be discussed. Oh. Okay. So in the end, I want to bring you some resources if you are interested in this topic. So we have published books for the Housen. That's actually initiated by the Degrowth environment here. And also the special issues and online resources that focus on urban degrowth, Housen degrowth, and the planning. And also two coming conferences. One is the one next week in Budapest. That's the first international symposium about specialized degrowth. And the other one, we are still in the phase of calling for abstract. That would be in Amsterdam. And for this conference, I'm part of the organization, so we welcome also contributions from practitioners, activists. So it's not just an academic event. And this is some of my publications around this topic, so that hopefully can be relevant to you.